I'd like to begin with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. These are prayer poems by Paramhansa Yogananda. This is Save Me from the Shipwreck on My Ocean of Dreams. Save me from shipwreck on the ocean of dreams. One more time. Mercury's in retrograde if I haven't... Internet cable? Yeah, it still won't have any power until the power comes back, which it isn't back, right? Is it back? No. Yeah, so until then... Yeah. Shave... Okay. Save me from shipwreck on my ocean of dreams. Thank you very much. I was shipwrecked on the storm-tossed ocean of mere dreams. My vessel of happiness was shattered utterly. Struggling, I tried to swim through those tossing waves of sadness and suffering. Then, suddenly, a little raft of hope, wafted to me by thy winds of mercy, came floating to me. I grasped it and held on. Little by little, floating thereon, I touched at last upon the golden isle of peaceful silence. Nymphs of thy blessings met me and took me to thy safe presence of eternal reassurance, beyond all waves of false, rising hopes and crashing disappointments. And this is from Rays of the One Light by Swami Kriyananda. These are parallel commentaries on the Bible and Bhagavad Gita. This week's reading is, in a certain way, a continuation of last week's reading. In fact, all the readings are a continuation of the previous weeks, except week 1. And they, thank you, Durga, for smiling and kind of laughing. It helps me kind of feel that I am making sense to someone. But we didn't read last week's reading, so I wanted to read an excerpt of it now. Jesus in the Bible is quoted here as saying, "All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." And it's easy to misunderstand this statement, especially if you've never heard it before, to make it seem like Jesus is saying anyone who taught anything before I did is a thief and a robber. And yet, also in the Bible, he says, "Think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." So it's a complete contradiction of saying that he was the only one true and anyone else was lying. I mean, Moses was lying, Krishna was lying. Of course he wasn't saying that. But it's easy to misunderstand that, because what does he mean then? So, Paramhansa Yogananda explained that the expression, "all that ever came before me," referred to those spiritual teachers who place their egos and their self-importance ahead of the Christ consciousness, in the sense of drawing people's devotion to themselves and not offering it where alone it truly belongs, to God. Yogananda himself was very firm in this regard. For example, he never spoke of anyone as his disciple. Instead, he always insisted they are God's disciples. God is the Guru, not I. Ego is a way station on the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The soul is first trapped in lower bodily forms. Slowly, it evolves to the human level, at which point self-consciousness appears. Only in human form can self-consciousness transcend material form altogether, including the lower identity of ego consciousness, and discover the true divine self within. Self-consciousness manifested as ego is an incentive to deliberate self-development. Later in this process of development, however, the ego becomes an obstruction. Inevitably, new spiritual aspirants do not emerge effortlessly from the vortex of ego consciousness. Desire must be offered up resolutely and ever more wholeheartedly on the altar of infinity. It is a gradual process, and few, even among those who seek to help others, are free of ego. If, however, their motive in teaching is not to serve, but to be served, they deserve a severe reprimand, as Jesus gave them. For their direction of development is no longer upward, but downward. In the name of giving up desires, they are creating new ones. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita, desire obscures even the wisdom of the wise. Their relentless foe it is, a flame never quenched. Intellect, mind, and senses, these combined are referred to as the seat of desire. Desire, through them, deludes and eclipses the discrimination of the embodied soul. O Arjuna, discipline your senses, and, having done so, work to destroy desire, annihilator of wisdom and of self-realization. Give God the credit for everything you do, Swamiji continues. See Him as the true doer. And so now, continuing on to this week, which is entitled, Ego, Friend or Foe. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ begins his Beatitudes with the words, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To be poor in spirit in such a way as to merit the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean to be poor-spirited. Rather, it means to see oneself as owning nothing, since all belongs to God, for all is a manifestation of His consciousness. St. John of the Cross wrote, If you would own everything, seek to own nothing. That which the ego relinquishes, offering it up to soul consciousness, is reclaimed forever in cosmic consciousness. Nothing is ever lost. Paramhansa Yogananda tells the story in Autobiography of a Yogi of the levitating saint, Bhaduri Mahashaya. Master, said a disciple of this saint once, ardently, you are wonderful. You have renounced riches and comforts to seek God and teach us wisdom. It was well known that Bhaduri Mahashaya had forsaken great family wealth in his early childhood when single-mindedly he entered the yogic path. You are reversing the case. The saint's face held mild rebuke. I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures, for a cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? I know the joy of sharing the treasure. Is that a sacrifice? The short-sighted worldly folk are verily the real renunciates. They relinquish an unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys. The Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter states, all things are everywhere by nature wrought in interaction of the qualities. The fool, cheated by self, thinks, this I did, and that I wrought. But thou strong-armed prince, a better lessoned mind, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense, and knowing how the qualities must qualify, standeth aloof even from his acts. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. Well, this topic of ego is such an important one on the spiritual path, and it can be approached in so many different ways. In the sense, I don't mean the subject can be approached, though it can, in many different ways, but actually that usually we are on one side of this, we're approaching this topic of ego from one side or another. One is, the ego is terrible, and it's an enemy to be defeated, murdered, killed. I have to destroy my ego. And that can be a helpful teaching. In fact, Master himself said, destroy that ego. The ego is a great obstruction. And so we have to be strong in the face of our ego. But at the same time, it can be a little bit, please, what do I want to say? Munadivanga. I was going to say Veliyavanga, Ulavanga, Pinadivanga, Munadivanga. Okay. So, the ego, on the other hand, part of us feels like, but if I destroy my ego, I'd be destroying myself. And so I don't really want to destroy my ego, or I don't mind destroying my ego as long as I can still have this, and this sort of held back in my safe deposit box. And even this happens to the saints. There was the story of the saint who was in the habit of, he was in the saintly habit of healing others. And then when he became ill, his disciples said, why don't you pray for yourself? And we just read the story somewhere, somehow, recently. I don't know when, but it was within the past, yuga. And he prayed to Divine Mother, and she appeared and said, of all things, you pray for your own body, you see yourself manifested in all these bodies, and yet you pay particular attention to this one. And so in that way, he was still suffering that little delusion. It wasn't a blemish, it wasn't a demerit. She said, you are no longer a saint, you must retake all your exams. She just said, she chastised him of all things. Even Lahiri Mahashaya was corrected by Babaji when he was explaining to his own friends, Lahiri Mahashaya, what a wonderful saint his guru Babaji was. And they said, yeah, right. And then he said, if I call him, he will materialize right here. And they said, really? Go ahead. And so this is all described in Autobiography of a Yogi. He went into a room and he closed the door and then he prayed to Babaji, and Babaji appeared next to him, and he didn't say, can I convince your doubting friends? He said, Lahiri, do you call me for a trifle? Meaning for a tiny, useless reason? He said, it's easy to believe when you have a miracle manifested before you, but it takes greater strength, I'm paraphrasing poorly, to believe in those things unseen, to reach out towards that. Remember, God doesn't remain hidden so that only the real people will seek Him. And if you really believe, you'll go through the invisibility field and you'll know that He's there. And if you're not, well, it just proves you don't want Him. It feels like that. But it's not that way at all. He shows himself constantly, even the fact that you're sitting here today. Think about how Master has changed your life. And remember, he has done it. The deeper you've gone in this path, see how he has changed your life. Remember the story of how Swamiji was growing on the spiritual path, and after some months he felt, because he had been working on developing devotion, he had been working on humility, he had been working on having less intellectuality and so on, that he had some reason, as he said, some cause for self-congratulation. Not bad. See what I have accomplished. It's natural, and it's not necessarily in itself wrong. And then word came to him that Master had been speaking of him with a group of other disciples, and Master said, see how I have changed Walter. Walter was the name Master always called Swamiji. See how I have changed Walter. You see, when we open ourselves up to the divine influence, it changes us, and yet we say, where are you? I don't get any results. I had this experience, a funny experience in a way, because a friend of mine asked me, have you ever experienced any miracles in your life? I know people on the spiritual path are always kind of like, I was walking through the forest and this rainbow came and it was a miracle. And, she was kind of referring to that kind of story getting related. And I had a parking ticket and then I didn't have to pay it and it was a miracle. I don't think we have parking tickets here, but you can imagine. Anyway, never mind. Do not wish for them. And so, well, in a way you do, but I won't explain how. You understand how. So there's no ticket. There's just a parking fee. Anyway, so she was saying to me, have you ever experienced any miracles in your life? And I said, I don't think so. I mean, I do feel that the greatest miracle in my life was coming onto this path, was reading Autobiography of a Yogi, was meeting Swamiji, was having my life change. That certainly was a miracle. But, you know, parking tickets and forest rainbows, I don't think I've had anything like that. And then I thought about it later, after I got off the phone with her or something, and then all these memories came flooding to me of all of the crazily miraculous things that have happened in my life. And Darwini was telling you the AC miracle from last week, and that's just one of so many miracles. So again, when you look at your life and actually take stock, you'll see a huge number of miracles. Just Vineet was telling us about a miracle that had happened for him, just in a small way, but those small ways are so sweet even. Because as Swamiji said, you sort of expect Master to save your life, especially if he wants to get any more work out of you. But otherwise, the little things, why should he even notice or bother? And so when Divine Mother helps you in little ways, then it's even more sweet, because it's not necessary, we feel. And yet she says, even this I want to help you with. So, it's important to remember that God isn't just hiding behind an invisibility cloak to test your true strength. So Babaji, when he appeared, said to Lahiri Mahashaya, said, it's easy to believe, and so this isn't really fair and right. But for the sake of not embarrassing you before your friends, I will see them. And so the door was opened, and all the friends of Lahiri Mahashaya were shocked that there was Babaji. And so many of them came to the spiritual path and so on. But later Babaji, or even actually at the time, Babaji said, from now on, my son, I will not come whenever you call me, but whenever you need me. And so when did now remember, Lahiri Mahashaya was an avatar, so he wasn't really suffering from ego. He was not only beyond ego, he was even beyond all past karma, which normal saints still have to deal with. But luckily for us, he played out this human drama so that we have something to relate to. If he just levitated into the room, and then, the chapatis levitated into his mouth, and then he levitated out, we would have nothing to relate to it. We just say, wow. But it wouldn't help us in our own struggles. I mean, we'd try to, but we wouldn't get anywhere. So when did Lahiri Mahashaya need Babaji? When he was at a Kumbh Mela and he saw, he was thinking about how many of these people are imposters. And then he saw Babaji washing the feet of a ascetic, if I have the story right, washing something, I think the feet. And then he said, to his own guru, the immortal Babaji, what are you doing? And he said, I am washing the feet of this saint, or of this, I think he said saint or sadhu. Afterwards, I will wash his utensils. He said, in this way, God is teaching me the quality most pleasing to him above all others, humility. And again, Babaji is a Maha Avatar. And yet he was saying, in this way I'm learning humility. Now he wasn't really learning humility, he was teaching humility to all of us. And humility is really that which is the antidote to the ego. But humility is often linked to the word humiliation. I should feel badly about myself. That just exaggerates the ego more. I'm so bad. I'm so bad. And then someone else says, I'm bad too. Not as bad as me. I'm much worse. Okay? It's just ridiculous. It's just exaggerating it. Negative infinity is just as extreme as positive infinity. And so it just is so, such a trap to say, no, I'm terrible. Now, it can be motivating to think of the things we have to work on. You have to see, again, which side of this you're approaching. If you're saying, actually, I am pretty good, I am doing well, and, I'd say I'm pretty spiritual. Yeah. Certainly more spiritual than average, more spiritual than you. And you think, well, we would never say that because it's so obviously wrong. But don't we get indignant sometimes when people are obviously acting in an incorrect manner? Don't you realize that's wrong? Listen, didn't we used to behave just like that? And don't so many people behave, for example, in selfish ways, thinking only of themselves? It's sort of our default setting, you might say, as it describes in the reading. First, we have to have self-consciousness. Then we emerge out of that self-consciousness finally into infinite consciousness. So if someone is acting in an egoic way, why be shocked? It is just the way things are. And don't be shocked because I know most people are underdeveloped, and so I'm not shocked. It's not that way at all. It's just to say, listen, this is the way we grow. This is the way in which they are learning. This is the way in which we are learning. Take it as a motivation when you see someone else's misbehavior to remind yourself of your own misbehavior in that same way. Because, as Master said to one of his disciples, remember, when you see anything wrong with the world, it's wrong with you. Sometimes that's a hard teaching, because you can look at disasters or, terrible tragedies and say, how is that wrong with me? But remember, as Master said, this world will go on like this. What are you worried about? Just as Anandamoy Ma said, he who made this world, don't you think he knows how to take care of it? Even if there's a horrible ending of an incarnation, there's another one. Dharmini and she was telling me the story of which may have not been completely true. It may have been sort of enhanced, but as it was told to her. But she said in the story, there was a woman who was singing and giving concerts, but wasn't really that good. And then the sort of technology for recording was new, and so she heard a recording of herself and realized it didn't sound at all how it sounded in her own ear. This is part of the skill of singing, is that you may sound very correct to yourself, but you have to actually be objectively matching the notes outward, and it can be learned. So if it's not coming naturally to you, don't worry. In fact, my mom told me I was tone deaf because I wasn't, which means you can't match notes at all. And I later did manage to learn how to match notes and sing. But the point is that this singer, when she heard herself and heard how she wasn't singing as she thought she was, she dropped dead on the spot. And so then we were laughing, not about that, but just saying, think of all the incarnations that have just ended in such a funny way. And you kind of look back at them after a while and be like, and there was that time, and I heard the record and I just died, just then. Yeah, it was really stupid, but I was so shocked and just died. And there was a man who, there's a story of the Past Life Pavilion. There's a movie where they had the Past Life Pavilion. And so in between lives, you could go to a little booth and you were shown one of your past lives. And so this one woman went in and she saw herself sort of as a man in, armor and everything, and said, "To the castle!" And, looking very strong and impressive. And she's sort of she wasn't the main character, but she was sort of the impressive character to make the main character feel a little more foolish, because he was always feeling foolish. So then they cut to an old man, and he goes in and presses the button, and then he sees this little girl, in old-fashioned clothes playing with a doll. And it says, "Rosie, time for lunch." And she says, "Coming, Mommy." And he says, "What the hell is this?" Because, he was this old, sort of stodgy man, and there he was as a little doll girl playing with a doll. And then the hero of the movie goes in, and he just sees himself running, holding a spear and having sort of paint and, maybe from Africa, and hearing this roar of an animal behind him. And then his friend says, "I think I was Prince Valiant. What were you? Who were you?" And he said, "I think I was lunch." So we have incarnations that end that way, and then we wonder why we're afraid of dogs. It's like, well, I remember, how the last one ended, and so I still haven't gotten it out of my system. So, it's called Defending Your Life. I wouldn't necessarily recommend all aspects of it. You can watch that scene. So the general trend, though, of the ego is it first has to become strong. And so, for example, you see this, as Swamiji wrote in the reading, that the person develops self-consciousness, self-awareness. And that as you come up from the animal stage, animals do have some ego, but they evolve more or less automatically. Swamiji had a dog named Jasper, and he said the dog was the laziest dog that ever walked the earth, or didn't even walk the earth, but sat on the earth. But he said once they were in Romania, which is where Swamiji grew up, and Jasper and his brother, Swamiji's brother, was taking Jasper for a walk. And the dog catchers came and saw this boy holding this dog and thought, well, we can easily get this dog and then collect basically a ransom to be paid to get the dog back. And so they started to go for the dog with their net and their stick. And Swamiji's brother held the stick and said, "Run, Jasper, run!" And he said the dog took off, which, I mean, it never had gone above, 0.1 kilometers per hour before it ran. And then they chased after it, and then it hid behind a bush. They ran past, and then it came back home. And so it showed a degree of intelligence. And so for weeks, whenever guests would come to the house, Swamiji's family would tell them the story of how brilliant their dog had outsmarted the dog catchers brilliantly. And so Swamiji said wherever Jasper was in the room, which was usually lying under a table, when he started to hear this story, he started going, and he said you could see that ego, that pleasure. So there's some degree of self-awareness, but it's only at the human level when we become fully self-aware. At the human level we become more self-aware. When we become fully self-aware, we become self-realized. So you could say the whole spiritual path is about increasing your own awareness. But when we become self-aware, we also become self-conscious. You see this most easily in children. It's especially helpful. I was a school teacher, and so you spend each day, because of I was teaching math and science in the beginning, and I taught it to every child in the school. The science, not the math, but I taught. So children starting in LKG and going all the way up to, in this case, 8th standard. So every day, or throughout the week, you're mixing with children of all different ages. And so you see at the younger ages how they're just so free. And of course you've seen this with little children in your lives. You meet a child and you sort of say hello, and if the child doesn't run or hide or cry, sometimes they just go like this. If you can't see, I'm raising my arms. I'm joking. Because they are so open-hearted. They're not self-conscious at all. And so they are so trusting, and they're also so free, just happily and joyful and so on. Then they get to about, 9, 10, 11, 12, whenever puberty hits, suddenly they become self-conscious. Before, they were seeing the world, and now they realize the world sees them. And how do I look? And how am I acting? And why is she acting that way and getting more attention than I'm getting? And do they like me? You see, all of that ego consciousness, that self-consciousness, meaning in this sense, being overly conscious of oneself, it all descends, and then come all of those troubles. So you often see, at least I saw in my own photos, you take a picture every year of the kid, and kindergarten and 1st standard, and then by the time we got to 5th standard, and then 6th or 7th standard. Just, because you have all of this self-consciousness, and it makes all the happiness go away if you're not careful. And so then we have to fight to grow out of that. We need that step to be able to realize I have to do something to improve myself. But when we concentrate only on that direction, it can be an obstacle. As Swamiji said, we shouldn't think that we're better than we are. And that's a very important teaching. We shouldn't think that we're better than we are. So if there's a temptation to spiritual pride, if there's a temptation to look down on, samsaris, those stuck in samsara who are just suffering, going after the pleasures of the world foolishly and blindly, then we should correct our own attitude. Someone said to Swamiji, there's a tendency to be critical of those doing some other spiritual activity. And Swamiji said, well, then that's your problem if you have it. He wasn't saying, yes, I understand. He was saying, well, why be critical? We don't have to control this world. We don't have to control what other people do. Sometimes I will say, let God be the policeman. And God will make sure that it all works out, that everybody who's doing wrong, as that one woman asked Swamiji, Swamiji, we are trying to be good, but we are suffering. And the bad people are having such a good time. And which, often comes up in different ways, but people have that feeling. But Swamiji said, it won't end up being a good time for them, and it won't end up as suffering for you. He might have said something else, I can't remember exactly. But he said we shouldn't think we're better than we are. So how do we express the thought that we think we're better than we are? When we judge someone for the way they are. Can't you at least control yourself? Can't you not speak in anger at people? You see? As Swamiji has a line in one of his plays, be careful, for the things we criticize in others, we reveal what we are ourselves. If we don't like it, it's because something in us is resonating with that, and we don't like it in ourselves. And so that's why some people will bug you, but not bug somebody else. They'll say, oh yeah, he's always shouting, but it never comes to anything, so it doesn't bother me. How does it not bother you? But it's like, well, I don't have that particular thing. Maybe you do, because it just bothers me. Sometimes we see people who act in a way that we used to act. And so we're not necessarily behaving in the same way now, but we don't want to go back to that. I was trying to get up every morning and be disciplined and meditate, and I had a project partner who loved to wake up at 10 p.m. and work through the night and then go to sleep. I think he was part vampire or something. But he was always awake at night and never awake during the day. And I had to work with him. And so it was either he came to my schedule or to my time zone, which he wasn't willing to do, so I had to work in his. And so I was so mad because I used to have that late night schedule and not an early morning schedule, and I was trying so hard to break that, and there he was just pulling me back into it. I was so mad, but it was just because I didn't want to go back to that lifestyle. We don't want to go back to that consciousness, and so sometimes we push away anybody who's acting just the way we used to. It's not fair. It's nothing to do with them. We can take it as an encouragement to ourselves. Let this be a reminder to me of how I didn't like to be that way. I don't want to be that way anymore. I choose to go this way, and in fact, I am going in this way. Turn it to a positive, but bring it back, our reaction back to our own selves, our own consciousness. So, again, if we speak heatedly at people and impatiently at people, well, then in a way we're thinking we're better than we are. What gives us the right to speak that way? They certainly don't have the right to speak to us that way. But we may have the right to speak to them that way. Because after all, if you knew, just see if it works. It hasn't seemed to yet. Now, on the other hand, Swamiji said we shouldn't think we're better than we are, but we shouldn't think that we're less than we are either. We should very much, if you're interested in these spiritual truths, if you've been meditating for years, if you're practicing Kriya Yoga, that takes a lot. And again, there's always that warning, hopefully, to not feel too proud, because we're only fully graduated when we're free in God. And I don't say that to say until you're free, you're nothing. It's rather to say, don't be satisfied with just a little bit. There was a beautiful story, I'm sure many of you read this week, from Jyotishji and Deviji's Touch of Light letter that they send out every week. And they shared this week a story from Nayaswami Kirtaniji, who is the spiritual director with her husband of Ananda Europe, based in Italy. And that's where Jyotishji and Deviji are for a few more days before they arrive in India on Thursday. And so Kirtani was basically working in the garden, and to make a long story short, she was basically working with the compost, which is the fertilizer, and she came across this really, decomposed, gross part, and it was full of baby flies. The English word is maggots, and that word itself makes, most people kind of go, just the word. I think there's a Malayalam word, attai, which is those long red centipedes or something that are not, everybody's kind of going. And so, of course, to me, it's just a word. And, of course, I was confusing attai with attai, and so that was... that did not go over very well with my aunt. And so, anyway, we were having lunch, and I said to my, anyway, never mind. So I said to my cousin, what are those things? I saw one, I almost stepped on it, and they said it's bad for and I said, attai, and he said, oh, please, not during lunch. But for me, it was just a word. So anyway, this word maggot has a similar kind of, reaction for many people in America. So anyway, she saw all these maggots in this thing, and she said, how can they stand to live in such a place? It was just so awful. And so then she finished her work, and she was walking back home or somewhere at Ananda village. Early days, some roads, but no cars, and I assume it was that time. I think, And so she was walking home, and she saw the sky was blue and beautiful, the trees were green, the sun was shining. It was just so lovely. And then she heard a divine voice in her ear say, how can you stand to live in such a place? And she said, what do you mean? See how beautiful it is. And she said, and the voice said, if you only knew what awaits you. Swamiji had a little experience of energy rising up his spine when he first started meditating, and he said to Master, Sir, I had this experience it was so joyful at the base of my spine, there was some energy. Master said, that's nothing. And it wasn't to put Swamiji in his place and say, let me tell you about samadhi. It was not that at all. He was saying, don't be satisfied. Don't be satisfied. And so, be grateful, be joyful, be peaceful, and yet also don't be complacent. It's a tricky thing, because on the one hand we want to be contented with the day, peaceful in our hearts, and at the same time we want to keep that yearning pushing forward towards more. And that's really what the ego does. As it becomes more and more spiritualized, it helps us become strong on the spiritual path, but ultimately then it becomes an obstruction, because it still says I helped this person by my wise counsel. I was able to meditate for 71 hours, and look how impressive that was. And on and on it goes. And so we have to be careful, even as the saints, as the Gita says, struggle with that desire to pull things back to ourselves. How does it happen in meditation, for example? We have a great meditation or a great experience, and then coming out of it we say, not bad. Or we say, listen, I want to tell you about this experience I had. It's an experience of God. It's not us, but the ego don't be too embarrassed, because it happens to everybody, but the ego grasps the blessings and claims them for itself. This I wrought, as it says. This I attracted. And so, on the other hand, just be grateful for everything. Now, how do you balance that, meaning grateful for everything you've accomplished so far? How do we balance this fine line between sort of being positive and encouraging ourselves and saying, listen, you're doing a good job, keep at it, and sort of criticizing ourselves or seeing all the shortcomings and saying, don't rest here? When someone asked Swamiji this question, he said, the only solution is just to stop thinking about yourself. He said that's the whole problem with all of it, is we're so excessively preoccupied with ourselves. He said anytime I see someone in a rut at Ananda, it's inevitably because they're just caught up in self-preoccupation, just thinking about themselves too much. He said if they start serving, if they start helping others, and you could add any other thing. If you start meditating, it relaxes the hold on the ego. But in this case, he said, it relaxes the hold the ego has on us. In any case, he said at that time, if they serve, they just come out of themselves. So it's such an easy way. If you're in a bad mood, call someone and try to cheer them up. If you don't feel like meditating, and you're not meditating strongly, as Swamiji said, then meditate more. The more you meditate, the more you want to meditate. The more you help others and think of others, the less we think about ourselves. And then it becomes this fine balancing line, as Swamiji said, becomes like a broad highway. You naturally have the sense of when this is something I should look at in myself and when this is something I should just forget about. As Swamiji said to Master, in overcoming desires, how do I overcome the desire for good food? Good, tasty food. I have that desire. How do I overcome that? And Master said, don't worry about the little things. When ecstasy comes, everything goes. God bless you.